asociados son los dueños de estos espacios en donde compartimos conocimientos, en donde compartimos ideas, preocupaciones sobre ciencia, tecnología e innovación. Daniel, como uno de los asociados, nos llamó y nos dijo, hay una persona de Alemania que va a venir, e hicimos una convocatoria para que ustedes pudieran oír las experiencias de los amigos alemanes. Entonces te voy a dejar a ti presentar a tu invitado.
Contarnos un poco de la experiencia de él trabajando en diferentes proyectos de comunicación científica en la Unión Europea y sus ideas sobre cómo mejorar la comunicación científica en Colombia, sobre cómo hacer que los comunicadores de la ciencia entiendan que en Colombia necesitamos más de esto, lo cual yo considero que es vital para el desarrollo de la ciencia del país, entiendan que en Colombia necesitamos más de esto. Lo cual yo considero que es vital para el desarrollo de la ciencia del país. Y pues para... Soy aquí. El profesor se me escondió un poco un segundo. Pero sí, entonces, por favor, démosle la bienvenida a los aplausos al profesor.
Vamos a dar la charla en inglés. Si necesita, pues ya estaba anunciada en inglés, pero creo que habla suficiente español para hacer las preguntas en español. Y no olviden, este espacio es de ustedes, apropiense de él.
Sí. Necesito utilizar el micrófono.
¿Estamos en streaming o no?
No. Is it live streamed or?
¿No estamos en
No?
streaming o sí? Si estamos en streaming, then
Oh,
you
okay.
need to use
Then maybe because I have a tendency to walk around, so I probably then would have to rather take it in mind. If that's okay?
Doesn't matter, but you have to keep it
Yeah.
very close.
Oh, very close, like this. Okay. Oh. Okay. If you want to come forward, then feel free. I don't bite. It's yeah. Then you might see better if you want to see anything. After all. Okay. Yeah. Muchas gracias por invitarme. It's very nice to be here. It was a bit complicated to get here. I was about una hora en el tráfico Bogotá, so it's por las 12. What's the block again? A block is Guarda, yeah. So that was actually not far. I could have walked probably, but I had a lot of luggage. So, and I was toying with their taking me Transmilenio. That probably would have been faster, I suppose. No, yeah. Okay, I'm here. It's great to be. I think we have a bit less than an hour now, probably. Yeah. I would try to maybe keep it to a bit more than half an hour, that we have a bit of time to discuss, because I suspect you have a few questions. I guess I'm here in a couple of roles, like with Daniel and his PhD, with the original objective to come to Bogota or to come to Colombia in general, because I'm going to Medellin tonight, to establish new opportunities for research and teaching collaborations with America Latina in general, because I've been traveling through Brazil, Argentina, Peru, Colombia, and I'm in Medellin tomorrow, and then in San Jose in Costa Rica afterwards, and Panama and Mexico. And all of that in kind of 15 days is a bit of a travel schedule, but it's, and maybe later I can explain in more detail, but I don't think that the research collaborations between Europe and America Latina are particularly strong. For example, my department at the moment cooperates with 21 institutions in 21 different countries, and that is from China to South Africa to Canada. There's not a single institution in the whole Latin American continent. And a few collaborations with UNAM in Mexico, but that's also not on a project basis. We have, like this would be one of my hats, would be the university, which was already mentioned, Germany's first fully international university. It's Rhine-Waal. Rhine is the river, like Amazonas of Europe. Well, almost, yeah. And the Waal is then when the Rhine crosses the border, the Dutch border. The Waal. It's not quite as big now. Well, the Rhine is, I think, is the biggest river in Europe. So that's kind of in terms of definitions. Yeah. Since we as academics tend to, we always start with definitions, whether that's a good idea or not is another question. So Rhine-Waal, as an international university, we have 80% of our students in the faculty are not from Germany. 4 out of 5 students are from all over the world. More than 100 different nations on campus, which makes it the most international academic institution in Europe. But at the moment, I have exactly 2 students from the whole Latin American continent. One from Peru and the other one from Mexico. Yeah, that's it. So that is very disappointing, and that's why I've taken the tour through America Latina to really establish those relations. I've had already great talks with La Sabena yesterday and with La Pontificia, the PUC in Lima and so on. So we had really good discussions, and we want to substantiate it. Yesterday with Ciencia, with El Director Cesar Ocampo, I think it is the new one, who also sees the need for internationalizing the Colombian endeavors in science and society, because that's what we're working on. There's a second hat, which you would see, but it's actually somewhere hidden down there. It's Euroscience or Euroscience, like Ciencia Europeana or whatever. It's like the AAAS of Europe. I've been on the governing board for a couple of years because that would probably be the equivalent to ACAC, I think. That's probably the equivalent. So that's why I think I understand quite well what. Well, it's a bit bigger, a bit bigger maybe, but it's. I think I understand quite well what you're trying to do and what you're doing and how you're doing it. Yeah, so that's that hat. And then there's another one. It's like in INSAICO. It's the Institute for Science and Innovation Communication, which is an extramural research institute for those who are in science. Know that sometimes there are institutions which are not part of a university but connected to the university as like an outside, very closely connected research institute. And that one, for example, does the entire evaluation of all major science communication activities in Germany. When the federal government, for example, announces a year of science for, I think it was the oceans and marine biology recently, then we evaluate it and we assess the impact and so on. So that's what we do. That's the campus. German university town. You always have a castle. There's it's Germany's most modern campus. They mushroomed out of the ground because the university was just founded 7 years ago, with the objective of internationalizing academia in Germany or in Europe in that case. Because if we're honest, that hasn't really worked very well. We have still only very few English-speaking programs in Europe, and from what I've heard, and I'm already, like tomorrow morning, I'm again in the Colegio Alemán in Medellin. The stories I hear is that many, like in this case, Colombian or Latin American young people are really toying with the idea of spending a bit of time abroad and studying in Europe, let's say. Which I think is great. I think every young person should make the experience of really going out of his or her own local environment. But then international for most students here means either Madrid or Barcelona, and so that's only like half international, I would say. Yeah, it's a bit of a shame, because then of course science is international and is in English. Everything's in English nowadays. Industry is international and in English. So that experience might be missing. On the other hand, sending your kids, as a Colombian father or mother, sending your kids to America or to Australia or even now to the United Kingdom, where you know you'll be spending, you know, $80,000, $100,000 over the course of 2 or 3 years, is not really an option for many people. So it's that's the story that I try to break. We are an international university. All our degree programs are in English. The staff is mostly in English. The students are from all over the world. And our tuition fees are either non-existent. If you have a European passport, we can even offer students the whole course for free. So there's no tuition fees if you have a Spanish or Italian or German or whatever passport. If there's a strategic cooperation, like the ones we are trying to set up with universities, we're having a discussion afterwards with Javeriana, I think is that how it's pronounced, yeah. So if there is a strategic cooperation, then whoever is signed in with those institutions is already entitled also to study with us for free for a semester, for a year, for whatever time they want. Even if not, then we speak about tuition fees of maybe 1,000 or 2,000 euros, and I think that's not really, well, it's not even close to what's in the UK. So. Yeah, yeah. So yeah, I usually start with that slide because it kind of defines the research areas which we undertake, because I'm supposed to speak today, I think, about there it is, la formación de la próxima generación de comunicadores de la ciencia y innovación. And I think the international tendencies, the international trends were also supposed to be part of it. Is that our plan? Yeah. So just to embed it into what is it actually that we're doing, because science communication sounds like, well, okay, yeah, science and its communication. Every scientist communicates more or less, but what exactly is it? What's the research field? So we usually break it down in public engagement. It's called upstream engagement in our case, to make the public engagement more inclusive, more interactive. Then there's evaluation and research methods. So we do research on research methods in social science in our field. Then there's the whole idea of open innovation, open science, and the impact that the digitalization of both the science and the communication of the science have. And then the whole idea of science, technology, and engineering in education, both formal education, informal, non-formal education. So these are the 4 areas. There are a few projects down here. For example, this one is an EU-funded project, as far as I've understood. ACAC is also a hub for Horizon 2020 for the European Framework Program. So you're also trying to find Colombian partners, I believe, who engage in these projects. And maybe we can remind me later that we talk about that, because I had the feeling that at Ciencia they weren't. Well, let's maybe talk about it later. Okay. But Nucleus, for example, I think is at the moment the biggest research project on science communication worldwide. It's with 25 countries in 25 institutions in 13 countries on 3 continents. We have the privilege to coordinate it. It's about the new understanding of commission, learning, and engagement in universities and scientific institutions. You always have these acronyms. Yeah, I hope I don't speak too fast, because some are looking at me quite puzzled. Okay. So if you want to follow the presentation, it should be under this link. You can also visit it later if you want to look at it in more detail. It's bit.ly, that's like a short link, bit.ly /ACAC hyphen, like a -17. You can also browse it live, like you've got your tablet there. So if I'm too slow for you, you can fast forward. If I'm too fast, yeah, okay. As I said, usually I use these slides to introduce what it is that I'm doing, and then when I think it was 2 days ago when I started looking at the ACAC website, I saw that actually the organization had kind of prepared a slide for me without knowing, to explain what it is that I'm doing, and it's that one, yeah, which is a bit hard to see here. You probably recall that here, yeah. So if I may, I would just zoom in and see to try to explain, because that actually explains most of what we're doing in Spanish. That's una oportunidad, so to speak. Yeah. This is from the SWOFS program. I think we're the only institution in Europe which runs several SWOFS projects at the same time at the moment, and we're preparing, I think, 4 research proposals in that program while we speak at the moment. So we're more or less involved in every SWOFS activity in this call. It's not a call, it's a program or a linea or whatever you call it. Linea, I think you call it, yeah. Yeah, so it's a multi-stage process of why are we looking at the relationships of science, that's the big S here, with and for society. Science with and for society. It starts with, it says here, cooperación entre la sociedad y la ciencia. That's what ACAC, I think, is advocating for. That's what you do. This is kind of that's the rationale of the whole thing. Then, reclutar nuevos, sorry for my accent, I hope you can suffer through it, yeah. Talentos para la ciencia. So I think I don't have to explain much about it, but it becomes a bit more complex now. Vincular la excelencia científica con la conciencia y la responsabilidad social. And that's where it becomes really interesting. We call that RRI in Europe, Responsible Research and Innovation, which isn't a paradigm suggesting that researchers behave irresponsibly, but it's an approach to redefine what responsibility actually means, what social responsibility means, what social robustness means, how socially robust is the work that we're doing. Like yesterday with Cesar, the discussion we had was, for example, there was this flood in Colombia a couple of months ago, I think, where people died. And of course, you always have a discussion, how could this happen? How could the houses be built so close to the river? And what about the regulations? What about early warning technologies that all exist? So couldn't that have been solved by engineering, if you want? So there was a technological failure or an engineering failure, that it was a political failure, that it wasn't regulated, that people were allowed to build their houses in these premises. There was a societal failure, that people weren't bothered and weren't interested. So if you want, that's a communication failure. And if we talk about science communication, then it's not about us explaining better what our 5th paper this year is all about, which nobody understands, and in journals which nobody reads, but it's, watch out, the doors are slamming. Ooh, boom. I warned you. I did. Everyone's awake now again. Here, la responsabilidad social, that is more of what we're doing. It's about reinvestigating the role that science and innovation play in society. We speak of social innovation, for example. Like I think you have the expression in Spanish, innovación productivo, I think is what's often used, isn't it? Yeah, well, that would be my step. Yeah. It's not just about technology transfer, it's not about commercialization just, it's not about the industry waiting for our knowledge in order to commercialize it into technological products or whatever. It's much more than that. It's how does that connect to the people and the needs in the country, the grand challenges. And it doesn't necessarily need to be climate mitigation, because it needs to be the big questions. Like in this open space in Lima, where they experimented with solar collectors, which then powered like a little drum, like with an electromotor, roasting the coffee beans for the farmers up in the Andes or in the Cordilleras, I think it would be here. Yeah. So it's a very low-tech innovation, where some of us, professor would say, this is what my undergraduate students do in their semester projects. This is not real. It's not innovation. It's a kind of it's engineering. Well, is it really? If this enables you to change the value chain, if it enables a local farmer up in the mountains to let's say not make 20 euro cents from a kilo of a coffee, but €2 from that, because he can deliver it in a roasted form. If he can send his children to school and potentially to university at some stage, because he's finally got, or she, mother maybe, who knows, finally got the money to actually send the kids to school, you see that you actually change, you have a societal impact. You change the lives of the people by low-tech innovation, but it's also social innovation. And that might be for particular, if I may say so, for emerging economies, much more relevant than the big science and the, I know that like I think in Colombia, you're very proud of your astronomical research. There's this saying, being closer to the stars, yeah? But that's usually big science, yeah? And if you, at least that's what I've heard. So if you plaster the walls with science and nature papers about astronomy, there's nothing against it. And the next Nobel laureate from Colombia, I think, will be a hero in this country. But is that really what the people need? Or is that all that they need? Or would they actually have, and that's the question that I also tried to get across yesterday, yeah? Because that is a science policy matter, yeah? Difficult as well, because to which extent do we as academics want to be navigated? To which extent do we want to be framed? To which extent do we want policy making to interfere with our freedom of research? So it's a difficult discussion. Okay, where were we? Here. El programa apoya actividades que involucren a todos los actores sociales. So it's not just even interdisciplinary research. It's what we call transdisciplinary research. We are including civil society. It's not anymore just economy and research and that classical technology transfer chain reaction, but it's society, policy, and research. So it's already a triangle. And that makes it transdisciplinary, also because it transcends then the classical idea. You're probably all familiar, kind of, I see people nodding. Investigadores, there it is, investigadores, políticos, comunicadores. Interesting that you use comunicadores. I've heard divulgadores as well. And to be honest, I hate the term divulgación, because what is vulgar about research? Why do we need to? But I mean, from a linguistic point of view, to vulgarize something is to dumb it down, to make it. well, it automatically becomes popular, but it becomes popular by vulgarizing it. Is that okay? Then it's an outside perception. Yeah. Yeah. Mm. Okay. Yeah. Then, if I may follow up on that, yeah, I mean, we're coming to that then in more detail. I think in a more systemic and more structural way in a minute. I can see I'm running out of time already. I mean, if we go through the objectives of why ACAC goes to work in the morning and why las divulgadores or comunicadores de la ciencia e innovación, what are their objectives? Is it just to open up to lay audiences and make sure that your grandmother and my aunt and everyone who doesn't really know what we're doing, that they have a basic understanding of that? Yeah. Is it about then? I mean, we're talking about periodismo, essentially. We need to, journalists who can explain the most complex research in the most easy manner. There's nothing wrong with it, but is that it? Is that the top priority? Is that the top objective? And by far, is it the only one? What about the whole political communication? To which extent does it's a rhetorical question, I don't really know, but to which extent does the Colombian parliament, the Colombian government, take on board the evidence, like with the example with the river flooding, the regulation of things like that. And that counts for every technology, for every innovation that is supposed to go on the market. Like when in Argentina, in a side sentence, I mentioned that one of the core activities of our university is sustainable agriculture. And then they, eyes lit up about that, like the beef industry. Then now we have the soy industry, and it's all Monsanto, and it's genetically modified, and people have a problem with that. The policy makers don't understand it, and I said, okay, I'm not an expert in this. I don't really know anything about the agricultural point of view, but I know. I mean, that's what we do. That's what we do in research, and that's how we train our comunicadores. Yeah, comunicadores. To understand, for example, from a social psychology point of view, to understand attitude formation in a society. How is something like that negotiated between the different stakeholders in society? There's NGOs and there's civil society. There is, here in America Latina, the church as well. We shouldn't forget that, yeah. Oh, I've already said something wrong, so someone's already leaving. So how is that negotiated in a society that you come to a point, to a certain conclusion after a while, where a certain technology, a certain research field, a certain school of thought, a certain paradigm, a certain philosophy is being shared among people, and that includes the lay people, but it also includes the policymakers, and to be honest, they are sometimes the most difficult ones when it comes to their numeracy and their understanding of statistics, or you name it, yeah. The imprensa, I mean, the industry is not just absorbing by osmosis what's coming out of research. That's a naive understanding of technology transfer from the 1960s. Yeah, it's a very interactive process where they articulate needs and where they try to understand markets. But it's also not supposed that we are just feeding into these understandings, but that we're rather supposed to, that communication is listening, that we should have our ear with the people and should understand what are their challenges. When they get up in the morning, what do they struggle with? I mean, just having spent more than an hour in an Uber for 12 blocks, I wonder whether logistics and something like that might be an issue in a city like Bogota with now 9 million people. When we live, okay, depends what the official number is and the unofficial probably. I mean, we lived for 10 years in Berlin and I started hating it, like spending hours every day in traffic. And Cleves is a small town, 50,000 inhabitants. I've got 6 minutes by bike from our house to campus, and we can do, my wife and I, the weekend shopping in 4 different supermarkets in an hour. I mean, that's, and we're back and already back with breakfast. So this is quality of life. Is that what people care about? Is that what's important to them? And the Transmilenio I think is something that is extremely successful. It's being copied all over the world, in developing countries and everywhere. But when I look at the buses, they're not entirely empty. So I think maybe there's a need for more lines, or to build on it, or to build, I don't know, a second layer, or whatever needs to happen. Yeah, I think the city is coming to its limits when it comes to capacity of public transport. Yeah, and is that a priority? And if so, what can science contribute to, for example, simulating certain tráficos en la ciudad. Yeah? Okay. Empresas, organizaciones civiles, there you go. Oh, you have them all. So I said all of that. Even there you go. And we have a fifth step. Trabajar juntos en el proceso de investigación e innovación a fin de, there it is, alinear mejor el proceso y los resultados, and I wouldn't be, actually, I would disagree with that part, con los valores, you know, it becomes almost philosophical now, necesidades y expectativas de la sociedad. So this is, I think it summarizes what I've just said, yeah? How do we align this with what people need, what they like, what they hate, what they don't like? And that raises all kinds of questions. Should we not do research that is unpopular? Should we only do research that goes down well with conscientias? Yeah? To which extent does the research environment need to align its activities entirely with society or with policymaking? It must be a trade-off. And that's, again, where, as you can imagine, since it's a very philosophical, a very fundamental question, which goes back to Galileo Galilei, I don't know, yeah. This is something where you need investigation, where you need solid, empirical, social science to find that out, to quantify and to qualify it in a country. What are the priorities? What are these values? What is the scientific culture? Is there a study on scientific culture in Colombia? Is there a study on public perception of different fields of research in Colombia? Probably, yeah. But even comparatively with other countries, you know, how do other countries approach that and so on? So that would be what I, from an outside perspective, or we, you know, in collaborating in the PhD research, that's where we would be extremely interested in looking into that, understanding it, and not by discussing it just in a meeting like this, but empirical research with generalizability to say we can now explain empirically how Colombia thinks about synthetic biology, or you name it. Yeah. Okay, so that's just, thank you very much for that, because it was the ideal introduction to what I was supposed to be saying. Just again, the short bit of shameless self-promotion, even though I don't have to really to sell it. This is our degree program. You have a short link here, which leads to the science communication program. It is unfortunately the only full-fledged science communication degree program in Europe at the moment. We have a few master's degrees in the UK, but well, if you think about it, many of you will be physicists or biologists. Am I doing something wrong here? Does that work? More or less. Would you be training a physicist in a year? Would you be training a chemist in a year? Probably not. Yeah? It usually takes a while to accumulate a certain knowledge. Yeah? That's what we do in science communication. We're having training programs in the masters where you get 1 year of science communication and then you write a thesis, which often even is a research thesis, just a literature review, and then you can call yourself a science communicator. What you are is a walking, talking physicist, a walking, talking biologist. If you really want the whole package of being a professional in science communication, then you need the time. That's why we spend 3 years. They study 2.5 years with us, then they do a whole semester abroad, mandatory, in a science communication environment. Here, for example, as interns, if we want to talk about that later. And then they do a research thesis, a proper research thesis with gathering their own data and the whole SPSS story. And then they get a degree, but only after 3.5 years and not just doing a bit of training. And there's nothing wrong with training STEM practitioners or our colleagues who work as deans and as postdocs and as PhD students somewhere in our research environments to train them in communicating better, giving them a bit of PowerPoint training and writing training. There's nothing wrong with that, yeah? But it doesn't answer to 1% what we were saying a minute ago. Who actually plans and conceptualizes the whole strategy of how a university connects to society and to policy and to the industry? Is that done by someone who got a bit of PowerPoint training to know how to present his research thesis? I don't think so. So this is a really complex, really complicated research field. In the meantime, we have 3 journals who continuously, every few months, already cover just science communication entirely. So that, I think, is already a sign of maturing of a certain research field. We've just recently conducted a bibliometric study, analyzed more than 3,000 research papers on science communication, and that was actually just the tip of the iceberg. Difficult question. Technically, yes, yeah, because you get what we call a bachelor degree in Europe. But I mean, you have to. You wouldn't. Again, it's the same story. You have to start somewhere. Yeah. Like with biology, you also have to do a basic course in biology first, before you can then specialize in synthetic biology or in biotechnology or something like that. It is a bachelor degree technically, but since it's the only one, for example, just like a few years ago, I always keep an update on that list who signs up for the next term. We have someone who's done his PhD in mathematics in Cambridge and who's coming to us to study in what technically is a bachelor degree. We have students who are 35 years of age, like one of my very few Latin American students who's Peruvian. She's got 2 children, she's married. I would say the average age is probably 25, 26 years in our program. That is not typical for undergraduate. Ideally, we would start with young people doing an then we would continue with a master's and then with a PhD and the classic tour, if you want. But since it's the only course at the moment, we are absorbing from all over the world, from Indonesia to Russia and from Peru to Canada, everyone who wants to professionalize in this field. So it's a bit of a strange compromise. Yeah. And we're working on that. We're also thinking about how can that be done with postgraduate diplomas and on a shorter period of time. Good luck with that. Yeah. I mean, I spent half a year just on the social psychology, and another half a year on political theory and political communication. We have a half year just on risk communication and crisis management, which is a research field in its own. Technology assessment and making technology assessment more participatory, for example, half a year. Storytelling is a technique. Storytelling is not just telling a story. Storytelling is a technique which you can actually learn formally and systematically. Marketing, of course, I could continue that list with 52 other modules that we have in the program. Yes, please. The main what? The main disciplines, you mean? Yeah. Well, since it's an undergrad, there are actually, I would say, half of them without any scientific background, which means they also have to do, half the course is like what we call Studium Generale in German, like general studies of natural sciences and engineering. They do physics, biology, chemistry, math, statistics, more physics, more math, more statistics, medicine, you name it. Yeah. If you're a trained mathematician, you're not going to do math in that course, of course. Then you get the credit transfer, and then that already shortens your study period. Those who already have pre-existing or previous education, and we have a YouTube video on the website there, which explains that a bit. Yeah, physics, I would say, but the whole field, like marine biology. Usually people who enjoyed studying that, but who realized quite early on that they don't want to spend the rest of their life behind the lab bench with fruit flies or whatever. Yeah, and there's nothing wrong with it. Yeah, I mean, but that's also something risky in what I'm saying. Do we want people to communicate research who decided for themselves that they don't want to do the research? Think about that for a minute. Yeah, so sometimes science communication is seen as a way out of hard science or way out of research. The second course director of this is a theoretical physicist. So the lunch discussions that we are having is on adapting simulation models for molecules to societal behavior. We're discussing on the deficiencies of SPSS in calculating intercoder reliability with this alpha or that alpha. This is the discussion that we're having. Every engineer is getting up at that point and saying, okay, I got an appointment, I need to go. Yeah? So if you consider social science, if I may crack that joke, as the hard science, yeah, because it is much harder to do with multivariate data, and I mean, if you really want to generalize on a societal level, this is something that is methodological, almost impossible. Yeah, a controlled experiment is comparatively easy. I know I'm making myself very unpopular by saying this, and I shouldn't be comparing it actually. We stand for interdisciplinarity more than any other field. Yeah? Any thesis that we see, any research project that we conduct, of course includes media studies and communication studies, communication theory, but also political sciences and psychology and sociology and philosophy of science And as I said, you know, natural science methods that we adapt to our social science questions or topics. Yeah? Does that answer the question a bit? Yeah, more than you originally intended, I suppose. So I probably have to rush a bit. Just very briefly, you can't read the joke. Something's wrong with the full screen mode, but sorry for that. I can paraphrase it. There you go. First, we have to convince people that good health isn't everything, is what they're agreeing, kind of that's their understanding of. We come to a science communication strategy. Science communication usually, as we define it, is the communication within science, scholarly publishing, conferencias, symposia, and so on. It's the communication about science, which used to be periodismo, but also in the meantime social media, of course, a blogger, Twitter, you name it. And then the communication between science and its stakeholders. And the stakeholders are, of course, as diverse as you can possibly. There's children and adults and industry and policymakers and so on. There are a couple of drivers down here, I don't know if you can read that, which are the reason why we are actually discussing that, and increasingly, like the conference, which is the reason why I'm actually on the Latin American conference, the original reason in Buenos Aires a few days ago. That was the annual conference of the Red de la Popularización Divulgación, Comunicación, Popularización de la Ciencia y Tecnología. Red Pop, it's called, a very interesting network across Latin America, and I was honored to give a speech, and we had a panel and so on. What did I want to say? Yeah, so 350 people at this conference, mostly practitioners, divulgadores, doing science communication. And why are they paid for that? Why do the institutions consider that to be relevant? Why, when I go to the Concitec in Peru and Ciencia here, why do they say this is top of on our agenda? We need to do much more of that. Why is that? Because I think for 4 reasons. There's the intrinsic motivation of people to, for example, committed journalists or committed communicators. They want to share the greatness of science and how solid it is and how systematic it is, and that we save the future of our children or whatever. All these stories, this very positivistic understanding of us saving the planet. There's a very intrinsic motivation, and it's good to know that because you can connect to that and can use it, yeah, in order to so that you don't have to convince old people like me, like profesores titulares, I think as you call them, people who may be happy with what they're doing in the day-to-day job. Yeah? They sometimes have to be convinced that this is something that makes a lot of sense and is important. Young researchers often have that intrinsic feeling, I need to go out, I need to share, I want to share this with the world. I think it's actually relevant what I'm doing to society. An improved appreciation as well. We have in the industry, in policy making, at least to some extent, they appreciate more what's going on in research. They see that it's necessary to do more of that, also to answer societal challenges. And that's where you need, of course, the communication. It's systemic competition, at least in most European or Western countries, where universities start competing against each other, and publications are counted, and this is a career mechanism. And I think, for example, in this country, as far as I've understood, the international collaborations of a university are counted, and that then goes into whatever, a score. And if you don't meet such a score, you can potentially lose your accreditation or something like that. So kind of a very quantitative way of assessing internationalization. At least that's how I understood it. Yeah. More complicated?
No, not quite. That's a simplification of something that is a little more deep than that.
Okay, later.
It's not just about numbers.
Okay, that's already good to hear, because it sounded to me like as if it was just the more programs you have, the better. And then, of course, nobody checks who goes and whether these people actually are happy and whether they've learned something and so on. But that's where we already are in evaluation methodologies. And as a political body or as a science policy body, do you actually listen, for example, to the social sciences, to the sociologists of science, who try to inform your, watch out, the door is going to slam in a minute again, inform your understanding as to how to measure that in research. We all know how flawed the scholarly publishing system is. We know that rankings stink methodologically more than anything that's being conducted in any of our departments. So basing the assessment of an academic institution on university rankings or on publication lists is, from a methodological perspective, a really irresponsible way to do it. So that's why you have initiatives like Altmetrics, for example, which already counts in social media reach and things like that. But anyway, so financing, political controlling, policymakers want to have an increasing control on what's going on, and so they want data to be reported back, such as, we've so and so many publications, so and so many interactions, visiting researchers. You have to report that back, and that goes into some kind of a database, and somebody draws conclusions from that. And again, that isn't without risk from a methodological point of view. You have all these stakeholders, which used to be like just the lay people, the kids and the people out there. But in the meantime, you also have here the lifelong learners, for example, so the people already working in the field who need what we call quaternary education, primary, secondary, tertiary, the quaternary education. Yeah. Industry politicians, statutory authorities, like those bodies who actually regulate technologies and make such decisions as when it comes to where to build houses, the NGOs, civil society at large, but we already had that. That's maybe in 3 steps, trying to make it a rounder picture. Why are we doing what it is that we're doing? Well, we originally, I think, wanted very much people to appreciate more what it is that we're doing, because we felt unappreciated. It's a bit, if you think about it, a bit like what children sometimes do, that when they're stubborn and say, I want, yeah? So no one's listening to me, no one's understanding me. We wanted to legitimize the fact that we're using public resources, right? I mean, me as a postdoc, I cost so and so many thousand pesos a year, so I need to tell society what I'm using their tax money for, yeah? It's in red because this is where we're coming from. Most of you will be in some form of a relationship, I suppose. If you reduce the communication with your wife, partner, fiancé, whatever, to legitimizing the fact that you're there, it's probably a pretty bad personal communication and relationship, so to speak. So what you would expect is that it's a much more a process of listening to each other, trying to understand each other, trust-building processes and things like that. So it's a much more complex thing. That's why anticipating needs is what communication is supposed to do nowadays. That's why when technology assessment doesn't assess the impact of technology, or what we sometimes call the ELSI, the ethical, legal and social implications of existing technologies and research, but rather to anticipate what the potential impact of a potential technology or innovation could be if that research was conducted. Okay, did I do anything? No. And from legitimization to inclusion, most of the science communication that is being conducted in the world is highly elitist. It reaches a fraction of the people, it reaches the educated, let's say 1 or 2 or 5% of the population. In Western societies, that increasingly questions the fact that science communication is being done at all, or whether that actually serves a purpose. We've just feedbacked our federal government that their major science communication activity reaches 80% of an audience which they actually don't want to reach. That is, would be quite devastating for any other objective or any other strategy, so to speak. In the UK, they're closing down the science centers because they cost a lot of money, and in the end, we with our children, we go on a Saturday, we go to the science center and we show them how great the moon landing was and whatever. But 90% of the people in Europe, not even on the southern hemisphere, 90% of the people in Europe never in their life go to a science festival, science cafe, science center, science museum. That's what I call elitist. Some are saying, well, only 10% go to the opera also. Yeah? We also have opera houses, so maybe this is something that has to do with culture. But if we are fine, if we're happy with the fact that the vast majority of a country is totally disinterested in what we're trying to communicate, then I think the communication is the problem and not the society. Is communication just a means to an end? Do we just do it in order to prove to governmental institutions, for example, that we're communicating? Hopefully not. Is it a means? So is it just a tool? Is it just today we do the open day, and then we do the festival, and then we have our campus magazine, and then we have the website, and then we have a social media channel, so check. Yeah? Is it just means that we do? Or could communication be an end in itself? Could we technically communicate science without doing the science? So could we communicate with societal actors, societal stakeholders, about what it is that we're doing or should be doing, will be doing, could be doing, have been doing, without actually discussing the content. Is there a discourse between civil society and the academic environment as to what each is expecting from one another? Trust-building measures, for example. There's a school of thought, I think it goes back into the 70s, we talked about the civic university, a university which is embedded in a regional, like an ecosystem where both live from each other, and they both kind of, it's a joint, it's a mutual relationship. The quadruple helix, the triple was originally politics, industry, and science, and as you can see in that triangle, the society is missing. So the quadruple helix, well, the triangle is not a helix anyway, and the geneticists probably will hate this analogy, but the quadruple helix would be something which also weaves the civil society into it. And there's RI, which we've mentioned, that's the paradigm in Europe at the moment, about to go out through the door, by the way. So this is probably the last year we're talking about RI. The next step in RI is then triple O, which is open science, open innovation, and open to the world. So that also includes the internationalization and things like that, which is should be one of the main topics, I think, which we should be discussing, because at the moment there is no real solid collaboration between researchers in Europe and America Latina on a level where, and we're cooperating more with Zimbabwe or people in yeah, well, that's the bad news now. You mean don't blame me. I wasn't born at that point. Yeah, so yeah. Anyway, yeah. And science as a social process, not science as something that is secluded, that is based on certain methodologies going on in a lab, but it's part of a process in society. Yeah, when I just in my Uber just passed, what was the slogan? It had "Paz" in it, of course. What else in this country? Colombia es La Paz or something like that, or en La Paz or something like that. So from a European perspective, it's so exciting to see how a country is coming out of a pretty difficult phase, yeah, rather violent phase, and almost reinventing itself. And we find that so exciting. I think Colombia is probably the most visible and attractive and outreaching country in America Latina at the moment. Maybe Mexico because it's so close to the US and so, but different story. So everything south of Mexico, I think it would be Colombia that people are looking at the moment. And there are funds, there are seed funds to, for example, for Horizon, if there are joint research proposals to be developed. The federal governments of most countries actually pay for the whole grant writing process. They pay for the flights, they pay for the grant writer, for the secretary, for the postdoc for months. And people aren't applying because there are no stable research collaborations between the countries, which is almost ridiculous if you think about it. Yeah. Okay, you just stop me anytime when it's too fast or too unclear. Cesar Campo was also mentioning yesterday science literacy, and we didn't really have the time to go into it because also it would have been probably quite politically incorrect if I had told him that I don't believe in an increase in science literacy to have the effect that we're supposed to have. This is a meta-study by Miller, like 2012, I think, where he took most of the science literacy research over the last couple of decades. And you know the idea, yeah, that is not just literacy to read and to write and to be able to calculate, but also to know whether a genetically modified tomato contains genes or a non-genetic, because like many people believe that a tomato only contains genes if it's genetically modified, or whether the Earth circles the sun or the sun circles the Earth. So these are science literacy questions. This is like they compared the European countries to the US. The United States is here in a second. That's Sweden. So the Swedes, when I show that graph, always, oh, very happy. So we're leading the pack. This is the EU average, EU 27. So this would be the EU average. And every researcher is probably already missing the scales. Yeah. They are missing because it's a joke, of course, because that is actually the scale. That means the questions like the one with the tomato or with the sun cannot be answered by more or by less than 1 out of 3 people correctly in the European Union. You could say, okay, well, it's a developing country anyway, or a developing region, but this could be worrying from an ACAC perspective, you know. Could it really be that less than a quarter of the people in this country don't know 7th grade science questions that I can't answer them correctly. Is that a problem? Well, let's think about it. Yeah? If we want to communicate, who do the people trust? Everyone usually, as an impulse, says, well, the journalists, of course, because they're independent and they're objective and they're not involved in the institutions. Well, the journalists are here. Yeah? TV journalists, newspaper journalists, and these numbers have been going down and down and down over the last few years. It used to be over 30%. I think they're down now at like 15%. Oh, these are the old numbers as well, yeah. Sorry for that. So they're even lower in the meantime. And who's on top? It's the researchers. People want to hear it from the horse's mouth, so to speak. And these are the researchers working in the university or a public environment, and these are the researchers in industry laboratories, which are then presumed to be maybe not as quite as independent as, but these are the people that people want to hear about science from. These are the trusted people. Government is down there, hardly to count. Yeah, the military as well. I don't know if that plays a role here. This is kind of we do these. This is the Eurobarometer studies. I think the largest empirical base that we have in Europe. On public perception of science. Science and technology can sort out any problem. It's a question which has been asked for the last decades, and they keep comparing these numbers. The inner circle is Germany, and the outer circle is the European average. People totally disagreeing with the fact that science and technology can sort out any problem is 3/4 of the German population. They say, no, this is not true. 57% in Europe, and those who totally agree is 1/10 in Europe and less than 1/4 in the EU. The way I present both statistics, this one and the science literacy one, gives the impression that I think that this is an issue or this is a problem. In scholarship, we're thinking about whether this critical way of looking at research is actually one of the largest achievements in the history of science. If a population is capable of questioning what it is that we're doing, to reflect what it is that we're doing, to respond to what it is that we're doing, the question is whether we should actually appreciate that and embrace it and enforce it and work with that instead of trying to work against a critical thinking and try to force it down with promotion and marketing. But that's, it would open up a long discussion. Give you 2 examples here. You probably don't see much as a dinosaur here, and there's Adam and Eve in the jungle. So as soon as you have Adam and Eve and the dinosaur in the same picture, something in terms of timing is wrong. Yeah. So this is from the Creation Museum in Petersburg in Kentucky, where I think the story is that the world is 10,000 years old. Is that how it goes? Yeah. Everyone, of course, who's involved in genetics, archaeology, geology, you name it, volcanology, knows that this is stupid. If in a presumably educated country like the United States, in every second school, evolution is not only being taught as a theory, but a theory that is about to be, it's questioned whether that is something that is true. And we're talking about countries like Turkey, where that's also the case. Then we know who we are against. This is actually in the meantime quite a battle. This is a goat where from the milk, I think you have spider silk proteins, which are then through the genetically modified organisms included in those freckles. That's an exhibit in the Post-Natural History Museum in Pittsburgh that displays that. How many people have an issue with that? How many people have a problem with the fact that there is suddenly a spider gene in the milk of a goat, if I understand that correctly? Good friend of mine, Sean Otto, has written a book about, that was 2009, I think, called Fool Me Twice, as an outcome of the largest political campaign in the history of the United States, which was the science debate, which some of you may have heard of. I don't have really the time to go very deep into it, but a really interesting read, Fool Me Twice. It's a quote by George W. Bush, as you can imagine. And that's the second one, which just came out a couple of weeks ago, The War on Science, where we're thinking about how to produce a global version of that. Fighting the assault on science in the US, and Sean speaks of a civil war. And I suppose in Colombia you have certain experiences with civil wars. He means a civil war between evidence and superstition, and between evidence and hypocrisy, and between evidence and people denying and ignoring everything we know as from a scientific method. The National Geographic is not exactly a political magazine. If they have a cover stating that it's a war on science, climate change does not exist, evolution never happened, the moon landing was fake, vaccines can lead to autism, and genetically modified food is evil. And usually you get this in pockets. You get people who believe that this is all the same story, it's all a problem, it's all an issue. So after reflecting why we're doing it, let's maybe quickly look at what we're doing. That was from a book of mine, I think from 2011, where we tried to break it down into certain historical phases. It all started out with very positivistic utopia, science fiction in the 1950s and 60s, where science can solve everything as such. Then came the Age of Enlightenment, where we wanted to make sure in communication that everyone embraces what it is that we're doing, because we need to make people more knowledgeable. Everyone needs to know more about science. In the meantime, of course, empirically, we know that the more people know, the more they criticize and the more they question science. So there's a negative correlation between an increase of knowledge and an increase of acceptance, or if a positive one to the decrease. If that's the fact, then informing people actually doesn't only not work, it's actually counterproductive as such alone. So you have to integrate the information into a much more complex strategy and picture as to how to approach that whole thing. Then, of course, when we realized that, and when we had the big 3 Mile Island disaster and the big technological disasters, we realized that we need to create more acceptance for the research and the innovation that's going on. That was also then done by political campaigns. The whole public health campaigns came up where, don't smoke, don't drink and drive. Then the public understanding of science and humanities as the era in the 2000s, when it was already expected that there should be more of a dialogue. That's where then public engagement came into play. We need to bring people in, we need to talk to them, we need to involve them, and trust theory and social science to operate, and all of these theories which then were developed in order to create a trust basis between those. And whatever we call that, of course, is up to definition, because we always define these steps in history, in historical sciences afterwards when things have happened. Here we just called it the age of participation, to make this whole thing more inclusive, more upstream, more integrated, more interactive. So not promoting, not marketing, not just screaming out how good we are, but trying to understand how the people tick and connecting to their world and to their values, as we just had it, their expectations, their anxieties, their needs, and so on. So we're coming from a dissemination point of view to a public engagement point of view, and nowadays, if you look into dialogue theory, then of course a dialogue is much different from a debate. It's much more different from just people sitting together and discussing. So how do you facilitate a real dialogue? That people don't talk about each other or to each other or to the audience, but actually with each other and things like that. There are techniques, there's training that you can give professionals to have a substantial theoretical and practical foundation of how to facilitate a proper dialogue, in order not just to communicate, in order not just to communicate the results of what we're doing. How can we expect people to understand the knowledge creation process if all they get is the final result? We want to discuss the process, and in the meantime also, why are we actually doing it? Why are we getting up at 8 o'clock in the morning? Why do we spend months on writing this paper? Why do we fly around the world? Why do we collaborate? Why do we think it's actually relevant? What's the driving force? Make science more humane, make it more personalized, show the faces, show the people, and make people understand of who actually does it and why we're doing it. Just as a list, there's no need to read that, but there's a wide variety of communication measures and tactics and activities that we can do. There's here you have white papers that are being written. You have Bright Club, which maybe some of you don't know. It's like science comedy. There's Open Day Science Festival. So and this is just a fraction of what's going on. In a degree program, of course, you would learn the basics of all of those tools. It's a toolbox. Where easily, probably we could come up in 5 minutes of a list of at least 50 of those, which are main tools of trade. So those need to be trained, and they become more diverse, which of course is a challenge, because who's an expert both in Twitter and in event management and in political sciences or political communication and regulation and technology, etc. It's a really wide and diverse field. Okay, so I'm coming towards the end because I think we're really running out of time. Is that okay? Another 5 or 10 minutes? Would that be? Oh, okay. Well, you know Francesco de Goya, I don't really have to explain that very much here. El sueño de la razón produce monstruos, I think it's how it's pronounced. So the idea of here you have the bats and the owls around. The owls usually symbolizing folly, the bats ignorance. So that was his idea. If reason goes to sleep, then you're being haunted by folly and ignorance. We're talking about the late 18th century. And the question I want to provoke with such an image is whether we have actually moved on since then, and whether this is still our understanding that people just have to be rational in order to make good decisions, or whether there's more to rationality. That, I mean, from psychology we know that most people do not base their decisions on rational assessment, like risk assessment, for example. When you cross the street, you don't calculate the probability of being run over by a car compared to walking down there and going where the traffic lights are, but you're making like a gut decision. And these are the decisions that a mother makes when she decides whether she vaccinates her daughter against HPV or not. This is a decision that a policymaker makes when he decides to regulate something or not. So balancing these things and these trade-offs is a much more emotional, oh God, this is very hard to read, than we would think. We probably have to read it out. The one is Galileo Galilei, of course, at the top. Or we can just zoom in. Yeah, if you click on the picture, no? In questions of science, the authority of 1,000 is not worth the humble reasoning of a single individual. And today we have things like Boko Haram, which literally translated is Western education is forbidden. We have Isaac Newton here. A man can imagine things that are false, but he can only understand things that are true. For if the things be false, the apprehension of them is not understanding. Yeah? So we have the supremacy of methods in contrast to what we nowadays would discuss as post-normal science, and the supremacy of facts with someone like Galileo saying, "E pur si muove," yet it moves, holding it against the clergy and saying, "I've got the empirical proof, I've got the geometrical proof," or whatever. And again, the question would be to which extent we have moved on. Two challenges with that. The one would be that whether it's particle physics or adaptive nanomaterials, scientists increasingly struggle with grasping the breadth of, what am I supposed to be saying? Okay, And that means, I mean, put two biologists in a room and they need 10 minutes to figure out what each other are doing because science is so specialized in the meantime. But already to grasp the breadth of the knowledge, and the second one would be that lay people increasingly fail to understand the reasoning behind what it is that we're doing. If someone is not supposed to drop his kid off at a private school in an SUV because we're contributing to the carbon footprint and this is irresponsible and it needs to be then the rationale behind not doing it, people don't get it. And that's not because they don't understand how climate change works. Oh, it's a greenhouse. Okay, understood that, But what has my car bloody well to do with it? So they don't understand the reasoning of a government making a decision forbidding SUVs, for example, or putting an additional tax on petrol or things like that. So the reasoning behind that is what we don't get across. And that the same goes for, if they're bioengineered substances that can biologically neutralize nitrate and phosphate in water, then should you incentivize that? Should you put a tax on that? Should you have that as a government initiative and so on? So we have these two challenges, which in relation to that create a totally different paradigm. If we think we have the supremacy of facts, if we think we have the monopoly of truth, if we think we have the supremacy of the method, then how are we expecting to get further in such a politically contested, highly complicated environment? So we need, there it would be there, see, it was all planned. So we need much more sophisticated, evidence-based, scientifically sound approaches to communicating science in society and with policymakers and so on than the ones we're using. Just briefly, you know, we're coming from, you have a classic academic institution doing research, teaching, and then so-called third mission activities, everything that is outreach, everything that, you know, connects to the stakeholders. So this is where we're coming from. You have the core activities and you have the periphery. Countries like Denmark, in the meantime, which have it in their, I think it's constitution also, or a law, which says every university needs to do research, teaching, and public engagement. So it's not an option anymore. It's not a periphery activity anymore. If you as a university do not commit roughly a third of your activities to connecting to stakeholders, you're not doing your job, the institution is going to be closed. So that's a different paradigm. In the Rome Declaration in 2015, I think it was, the European Commission redefined the excellence in science. Excellence in science used to be, we have our data under control, we know what we're doing, we do our statistics, we're working profoundly, we're doing good and ethically sound research. The European Commission is saying this is not excellent research anymore. Research is only excellent if it connects to societal needs and values. If that is not proven, it's not excellent research. They're not saying it's not additionally well communicated. No, it's not research in the first place. And I think it was Niels Bohr who originally said, research not communicated is research never done, not shared. And I'm talking to the converted here, but maybe some people who are watching this either streamed or taped or whatever might think about that sentence and say, I don't agree, you know, I just want to do my research, I want to be left alone. The newer understanding would be that if there is public engagement, it reaches into those research and teaching environments, so you have a more transformative, responsive, a demand-led set of activities than just an add-on, like an appendix from a medical point of view, something that you actually don't need, but you have it. So it has some function, apparently. Okay, so that's more a soft boundary which runs through somewhere here, and sometimes it's very hard to distinguish what's actually now the promotion, or what's the divulgación or the popularización, and what's the actual investigación. And you could argue that this is a risk, or you could see it as an opportunity, but it's, if it's about the avance, or the advancement of science, then if communication is become one of the key drivers to advance science in society, then maybe we should see that as an opportunity. There's a third version of that, because usually you have academic institutions and non-academic knowledge. People out in the streets, or even like where I'm flying tonight, you know, I think you have there still parts in Medellin where you have favelas, or really poor areas at least, where people probably couldn't care less what we're doing here, if we're honest. They don't really connect. Still, we believe, I suppose, that the whole of society should be more or less on board, because we're doing it in the end for society at large. So they have a knowledge as well. Does that knowledge not count because they never went to university? Does it not count because they even, you know, they can't do basic maths or what have you? If you look into citizen science research, and now you don't really have the time to look into this, just to scrape the surface, I think we have, in the meantime, hundreds of case studies where we have shown that non-academic knowledge is contributing to the scientific process, sometimes more than the substantial, systematic, inward-looking scientific process itself. So if those two areas start, not overlap of course, but start to merge, you bring on board lay knowledge, and you try to include the scientific knowledge, try to translate it in a way that people can actually do something with it, then you create something like an agora, and that's again where RI comes into play, where together civil society and science conduct research, generate new knowledge, apply the knowledge, and that's, I think, more or less what I wanted to say. You got the link here up there again. I know it was a bit longer than expected. I got carried away with a few points, as it often happens. My email address, this is a Twitter handle, so in case, maybe I should have said that before, in case somebody wants to tweet. And you find me on LinkedIn, which sometimes maybe is a good way to connect afterwards if you want to see what we're doing or whatever, because I'll only be here in Bogota for another few hours, really. You're looking at me because you probably don't have time to discuss. A few minutes maybe to discuss some questions. Should the person asking the question also use the microphone? Las preguntas también en inglés, yeah. En español, si es necesitamos or whatever. Should they use the microphone as well? Because otherwise, Ah, okay, the camera. Messing up the system. Hello.
Hola. Comentabas que hay casos en los que el conocimiento no científico contribuye a hacer conocimiento científico, a fabricarlo, ¿cierto? ¿Tendrías de pronto dentro de tu experiencia algún ejemplo práctico en el que eso haya ocurrido y cómo? Es parte del objeto de estudio que estamos analizando en un grupo de investigación en la Universidad Central y nos interesa esa información.
He wants examples.
Yeah.
Okay.
It will be a lot helpful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, bit unprepared, of course, but because we're categorizing that at the moment, we're doing a study, because it's not citizen science and not citizen science. Sometimes you just, like the city at home project, for example, where you just use computer power of people. So you have different degrees. I actually had that in the presentation, but I knew it would have been too long. The different degrees of participation. Now you can just use people's workforce to get the job done, or you can actually include them, for example, in defining the research question or in defining the approach and the methodology for a certain research question. If you have a pensioner living up on the third floor of Calle Número Uno, big major street, and the city, that's a small one, or?
No, the way it's the translation, the way we pronounce that is a little different.
Oh, yeah, I'm sure it is. Yeah. So if the city council of Bogota is considering to build another Transmilenio or another tram, let's say a tram line, the first tram in Bogota, that would be a cool project, right? Or not, who knows? So they actually come to Javeriana and say, you've got these mathematicians, could they not simulate the logistics in that street, depending on, if you build the tram line on this side or on that side or in the middle like it's being done here, we need bridges, it doesn't make it more expensive. Should we close it down? Should we use the lane by both cars and trams? Can people still pass the street? How does that measure impact the actual building of that tram line? This is how, if you think from a scientific point of view, this is how we should approach it. We should systematize it, we should analyze our data, we should simulate it, we should make models, we should like different trajectories and different pathways. There's version A, B, C, D, E, and the probability of model B to actually be effective is 37% with a standard deviation or whatever. This is how we would kind of tend to approach it. And then there's this pensioner living up on the third floor who's in a wheelchair and has been figurative, just making this up now, of course. So he's been sitting in that wheelchair at the window all day for the last 10 years and looking out, because that's all he can do. He's boring life, it's kind of looking out. Poor guy. But he's watching everything that's going on down there. So he knows that at 10 o'clock in the morning when the rush hour is gone, some mothers come with their trams, with their whatever it's called, like with the babies in there, and they struggle getting over the street because there's so much traffic, and then if the tram goes by, they couldn't cross it, so that could be an issue. Or he says, well, there's the rush hour ends officially, or kind of tends to end at 9, but there's a second peak somewhere at 10:30, which is not measured because we weren't looking into that in our data. We were just ignoring that, for example. So that guy up there might have a better understanding from an intuitive, anecdotal evidence point of view than any data gathering of let's have a sensor measuring the number of cars going over a certain point per second, and then extrapolating that to the year. Maybe it's something is happening in March when we did these measurements. Maybe in March last year something was entirely different because the petrol was more expensive, or because the weather was warmer. When I was in Buenos Aires, I traveled in the morning. I had to travel to an appointment. I used the metro. They have a metro system, yeah, and it was fine until it started raining, and then everyone said, okay, let's take the metro today, because it was a real rain, kind of as you have it here in in these regions, so it was really pouring down. So I saw the trains go by, one after the other, packed to the nines, like in Japan where they squeeze in the people. They're all packed full. So you can do whatever simulation you want. If you don't account for the rain, then if it does rain, then the whole system breaks apart. So it's bringing in evidence-based, like experience-based or anecdotal evidence like that, which increases your understanding. And there's so many projects in the meantime, like with optimizing the antennas for cellular telephony. Then you can simulate that as well, and you can have a very engineering approach of how to do it best. For example, you here in the hills, you have all these antennas up there because apparently it works best. Yeah. But maybe there's a high skyscraper made out of a lot of glass. Glass is the most efficient way to actually, I think, block these wavelengths. Yeah. So on the other side of that tower, actually, you don't have any reception. You could say, well, technically, if your geographical data is good enough, then you could actually take that into account. But every model has its limitations, right? So then local citizens are arguing, yeah, but that works, but it doesn't work behind that tower. And it doesn't work on Thursdays, because on Thursdays, there's like the trade center is somewhere here around the corner, for example. So if 1,000 people leave the trade center, then one cell won't be enough. Yeah? So you have to take all of these things into account, and any scientific approach is always limited as to how much data you can process. Even automatically with big data nowadays, you have to make decisions as to what you can look at and what not. And a human brain is capable to, take that out and that out and that out and concentrate. But there is something that you missed, the more qualitative way to look at it. So, But citizen science is a broad field. Yeah, it's Comentario.
Just a comment. So I loved your talk. I thought it was fantastic. Thank you. I think it makes it makes me realize that the issue of communicating science is so much more complex than we had it, and it's not just like a one-sided conversation. And but I guess I have another question, and that is, how do you? Because I've seen that people really don't change their minds. So even if you have like very like well-educated people and you're discussing about particular issues, let's say vaccines. And so it's difficult, to a point, and then at some point you say, okay, forget it, I won't talk about this anymore. But then the other issue nowadays that is very relevant is the internet. People are looking at all their information on the internet, and most of that information is not reliable, yet they believe that it is. Not only the internet, but the phones and everything. So what do you think of that?
That line of internet misses in your chart that about the credibility of social sectors, and internet is maybe the first one now.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, they believe it, but I don't really think it's that believable.
And is it una oportunidad, or is it a risk or a challenge? Yeah? I mean, the question you've asked would open for at least 3 more presentations. Like the first immediate response from me would be wanting to change someone's behavior, which is what, yeah? Do we want to do that? No? Well, vaccines? We want people to vaccinate? Yeah, but so kind of we agree on that, yeah? There was a catch, so I just caught you. Because if you want to change someone's behavior, is that actually democratic? Is that taking people serious? Like, I know how it works, you shouldn't smoke. If you smoke in public spaces, you're going to be fined, you know? It's a policy, and I'm not my cigar every now and then, but I can appreciate it. I can actually sit in a restaurant without being tormented by smoke all the time. But the first question would be, is it actually the right approach to assume that we are supposed to change other people's behavior? Or should we enable people to reflect their behavior in a way that they can potentially consider whether they want to change? And if they say, I want to drive that SUV, I earn my money, I work 70 hours a week, so I want to drive that SUV, bugger off. Yeah? This is my hobby, like things you would maybe hear more from male than from female people, I don't know. But this is my thing. I want to have my big car, okay? Once the sons and the daughters in the back of that SUV at some stage tell their parents, could you leave me off at that corner over there, not in front of the school, because I'm so, then it's not us telling them, do you know about climate change? Do you know that 16 liters per 100 kilometers is actually unnecessary, and that, you know, it's a different thing. It suddenly becomes emotional. It suddenly becomes a value. It suddenly becomes, oh, my children actually care about their future, and they think that I'm stealing their future by driving that car. Oops, they don't want me to drive them to school anymore. That's a totally different understanding. I mean, from the evidence, from the empirical evidence over, let's say, now half a century of research, psychology, political sciences, behavioral sciences, we forgot that earlier, sociology, and so on, we can make recommendations. For example, we know that when there is an evacuation, an earthquake, and then a car goes around, like Houston, we're just seeing that actually live while we speak, good example in that case, and people are told to leave. They lock up, go and leave, evacuate, right? Then it depends on country to country whether they're actually going to do that. The first thing that most people will do is ask their neighbor. Well, the neighbor is probably neither a geologist nor a crisis manager nor an evacuation expert or whatever, but it's your neighbor who has been there for the last 15 years. So are you going or are you staying? I'm staying. Oh, I'm staying as well. Yeah? So this, and if you then empirically look at what are the predictors, what are the variables that determine whether someone believes more in the neighbor or more in that, you know, the car with the announcements up on top, that is actually mostly based on the trust in governmental institutions or the trust in the institution. If it's a police car announcing it, if it's a government institution announcing it, if it's a university announcing it, that already makes a lot of difference. Yeah? A university wouldn't be doing it. For example, there were investigations in how Zika was communicated, and that actually the misconceptions of Zika spread faster than the virus spread virally as itself, which is from a epidemiological perspective highly interesting, you know, to understand why is this happening, how is this happening, and then what's the communication approach? Explain it, force people, try to win them over. Yeah? If they're not trusting the institution, whatever the institution communicated is not going to work. And again, I mean, you're going to ask probably for examples for which we don't have the time, but believe me or not, you know, there are loads of studies which have shown that more information doesn't increase acceptance, but it kind of splits them into two. Those who are against it, they are going to say, well, I'm going to be, they want to manipulate me here, so I always knew it, I finally have the arguments to be more against it than ever. And those who are always for it finally say, you know, thank you for the argument, I can finally convince my cousin that they're supposed to vaccinate their children. Yeah? So actually split the audience. That's where then risk communication comes in. How do we communicate? Do we communicate absolute risks or relative risks, for example? Do people understand that? Do we need to, first of all, explain the statistics behind it and probabilities and things like that before we can actually start to do that? And before we can explain that, we have to, like, the ears have to be open. You can't talk to someone who has closed ears. How do we open those ears? Well, maybe by trying to figure out what they need and what they understand, what they think. Like dialogue theory has there's this so-called PIN model where it's like two icebergs or two mountains which are kind of sitting beside each other. Also a good example with 2,500 meters of altitude here. So two mountains, yeah, and you have like a panel discussion, and you have a Greenpeace member and someone from Monsanto, for example. They probably won't agree on much in that discussion, I would think, because she has her position, he has his position. So if they discuss for 2 hours, they probably won't get any closer because they're actually not talking to each other, they're talking to an audience with pre-conceptualized statements and so on. So on the position, the P level, on the positions level, they will never, ever get closer to each other. And it's like you and someone in your family who doesn't vaccinate, for example. Yeah, same thing. If you try to get a bit lower, then if you can imagine those mountains, a bit hard to do it without a blackboard now or a whiteboard, then if you go on a lower level, like the interests, that's the I, P-I-N, yeah? The lower level, the interests, is when things start to overlap, because those two people might have similar interests. They may both have children, and they both care maybe about the future of their children. The Monsanto guy thinks that GMOs are a contribution to or against world hunger, and the Greenpeace person says, yeah, but you know, we have to think about the economic. But so they have different positions, but they both have children, and they both actually care about how to secure their future. If you go one level below, that's when all the values come in and the norms. Yeah? And how do people feel? Like, do they care about their natural environment? And then both would probably say, yeah, I've got a big garden and I care for my plants and I have 2 dogs and, oh, you have got dogs as well. What kind of dogs are they? Oh, the golden retrievers. Kind of. So on the lowest level, you have almost 100% overlap between what people like us think. We share common values, you know. You wouldn't steal my purse now, I wouldn't steal yours. So we already agree on something regardless of what our attitudes or our positions are. Yeah? So instead of working on that level, trying to get down on well, as far as possible and working your way up from the bottom. That is extremely hard work. It takes months, it takes years, it takes decades maybe in a country, but it's a culture change. It's not a knowledge change, it's a culture change. And that's what makes it so complicated. That's why you need essentially psychologists and sociologists and philosophers and people like that. And a professional science communicator is that in one person. And maybe to round it up with what was in the announcement, if my Spanish didn't trick me, las 3 generaciones de las comunicadores de la ciencia. I think we announced it something like, we started out in the 70s and 80s with, we had these researchers who were good at communicating, good at talking. So like the Neil deGrasse Tysons or whatever, yeah, even though he's actually quite recent. So those were our science communicators. The second generation were the ones who then actually did some master's degrees. So they were a bit like trained in how to communicate professionally, still with a scientific background and a bit of communication attitude. That third generation is getting the whole package. They don't need to be an expert in particle physics, but they need to understand what science does in most of these disciplines, applied and fundamental and all of these things, how the methods work, what the rationale behind it, how a theory comes about and things like that, what the scientific method is in the first place. So they need to understand that. And all of these skills in terms of psychology and policy and understanding all of that, the systems theory. So if they have both of that, then the third generation of science communicators, I think, is capable to actually make that change. We're having a conference later this year in Italy called evidence-based science communication, like evidence-based medicine, like the Cochrane principle or so. If you adapt that to communication, you would expect people to base their strategic communication decisions as to, like, you know, I got that flyer from Consensus yesterday. They have these nine categories where they have calls and initiatives for science popularization and for kids and for science centers and so on. Yeah, it's, and what I try to get across is who's actually decided on an evidence base at some point what the priorities are. Yeah? Are those 9 exactly the ones that connect to the Colombian people? Probably, maybe, I don't know. I'm just an outsider, I can just ask the question, you know, the dumb question. But in whatever way you do it, yeah, there should be a process which accompanies the actual practice of reaching out with an investigation to understand how we should reach out. And that is not to be defined by you or even by me, well, by the science communication researchers maybe to some extent, but not by the policymakers, not by the institutions, but essentially by them out there, by the people. You know? What do they expect from a university? Maybe something entirely different from what we think. What is innovation for them? What is value creation for them? What is knowledge creation for them? So that's again, we'll be back with social innovation and RRI and OOO and you name it. Yeah. Yeah, muchas gracias por invitarme. It was really nice to be here. It's yeah.
Alexander. Pero muy interesante. Toda la charla estuvo grabada, entonces si hay alguien que quiere revisar ciertos puntos o algo así, va a estar en el sitio web de ACAC. Solamente los voy a invitar a una cosa. Este tipo de charlas que nos inspiran, que nos llenan de ideas, van a estar en Ciencia. Entonces en sus calendarios, por favor, vayan poniendo las fechas 19 al 22 de octubre en Corferias. Vamos a tener este tipo de charlas y muchos más, los niños, las personas que están trabajando tecnologías de punta, etcétera. Entonces los esperamos en Ciencia. Muchas gracias y gracias a Daniel.